problems. I get distracted by noise easily. Okay. I forgot to, when I introduced myself, I forgot to tell you my area of expertise because I was distracted because I was letting people into Zoom. I've always been a special day class teacher, students with disabilities in my classroom, or a resource teacher. And so that's the area that I have mostly worked in. So special day class, the students would be in some of those classes. Let's say, for example, they need a math special day class, they would be in there. Or maybe they need an English special day class, but we don't automatically take a student and put them into all special day classes immediately. We look at that student and what their needs are and put them into some general education and some special education. But then there are students who have all their core classes in special education, in special day class, and they have general education electives. Most students have a general education elective, except some may not. I know students that Christy has taught with more severe disabilities. Some of them have not always been in electives, so they've been in a special day class all day. Of course, our goal is always to make sure they can get into an elective or possibly PE, but that's the next level. And then in our district, and I'm not sure about other districts, potentially you have a special school for students with disabilities that are more severe. In our district, it's a school for students with severe emotional disabilities. They cannot function even in that with emotional disabilities in the special day class on their comprehensive campus. They still can't be successful. They need that more therapeutic setting at a special school, and we have that. And then the last one is home study or non-public school. So that's your support continuum of students going from the least restrictive to most restrictive environment.
So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures, and I want you to think about the message that's portrayed in this picture. You've probably seen, if not this picture, something very similar. So now here's a second picture. So just think for a second, what is the relation in this picture? And then here's our third picture. So what does this picture communicate? Does anybody want to put in the chat just kind of what the difference that they see in those pictures? Stephanie says in the first one, everyone gets the same thing. Exactly. You have equality versus equity. Yeah, the first one, everyone is being treated the same. The second one, everybody is given, equal access, right? As Rena said, fair is not always equal. And the last one is inclusion because the barriers are removed. And so that is the biggest thing that we're going to try to communicate with our strategies, is looking at how can we recognize our barriers that we have in our classroom, and then how can we work to remove those barriers for all of our students. And in order to do that, we need to make sure that we know our students' abilities, what skills they have, what accommodations and modifications that they need. And then also I want you to think just for a minute, when I first had you think about what inclusion was, right? What were some of your thoughts? Is it possible that some of your own thoughts are a barrier to our students? Again, you can answer that yourself. So I love this. Equity means that everyone gets what they need to be successful, and inclusion means we all have something to contribute. So as we go throughout the workshop, if you're thinking about different strategies and stuff you can implement, be sure that you're also thinking about how each of your students are going to be able to contribute to your classroom. So I'm going to show you a short video. Now, this video was originally created by people at Google. So it's talking about some programmers at Google, and it's asking us to consider our unconscious bias. So I want you, as you're watching this video, think of how the idea of unconscious bias plays into your classroom. As someone, when this starts, just make sure that I can hear.
Christy, there's no sound. It's supposed to be sound.
I apologize.
I only asked that because there's subtitles, so I wasn't sure.
If everybody were aware
Is that better?
of the stereotypes that they have and the biases that they have. When we talk about unconscious bias, we're basically saying our worldview can actually exert an influence beyond our conscious awareness, and it creates ambiguity.
You go to an engineer who's built something extremely innovative, and you say, who do you think your user is? This is where I have the most fun. My name is TV Raman, and I led our work on Android accessibility for 3 years. Write out everything that you think you know about your user with respect to abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable, because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts.
Okay, now I'm getting a message that the video is not working, not playing, right?
Right. Right.
Abilities, inabilities, special abilities, disabilities. Almost every assumption that you write down on that whiteboard about this is the user I think I'm building for is questionable, because our various unconscious biases define the boundaries you're unwilling to expand.
These biases, they're the shortcuts that our brain has created so that we can deal with the information that we process every single day.
Right when we see anyone, whether we think about it or not, we are implicitly, automatically making judgments about how warm and competent that person or thing is.
All humans need to make decisions. And so we fill in the blanks because our brains are wired to do that. And we fill in with things we don't know with, past experience. Oh, you pattern map to someone I think I should hire. So I'm going to hire you versus this person because they didn't map, because I can't fill in the blank because they don't look like me or they're not from my same background. And so I can't see how they're going to make the jump.
Every single person is great at things that you may not expect them to be, but it's really hard for us to see that when we're so powerfully guided by the things we expect to be true in the world.
I grew up surrounded with this conversation about what you can't do and what you won't be able to do. My name's Enrico, and I'm an autistic software engineer. The first time I go through the performance review process, I was asked for 5 strengths. It was the first time that I had ever been prompted to think in that way about myself, and it was really a life-changing moment for me.
When we are working in our day-to-day jobs, we are still making judgments about the people around us, about the resumes we see, about the employees that we're trying to decide, whether to put them on teams or not.
People are very wedded to the idea that they can perceive something objectively, and statistically they're wrong. But it's hard. You become attached to this idea that you can assess something by looking at it.
These subtle assumptions we make about people can have lasting effects on who we're promoting, who we're hiring, who we're putting in leadership positions. We have the responsibility to understand the assumptions that we make and understand the errors that we make.
But it's not just for the collective good. If you take the time to understand more about this, there are things that you can implement for yourself that'll help you develop as a leader and to do your job even better.
It made me realize how often I have a very strong belief that is simply incorrect. When I look at one of these evaluation situations, the first question is, how can I eliminate the sources of potential bias and leave just the data so we can actually make better decisions?
If you're not conscious of the biases that you have, you're just not contributing at the level that you could, and you're not innovating at the level you could. And so your products won't be as good. Your results won't be as good.
When you think outside the box with respect to the assumptions you made about how somebody would use this wonderful thing you built, and when you sort of broaden that perspective as to who you change the world for, you build something even bigger.
Okay, so what are your initial thoughts? How can being aware of our unconscious biases make a difference in the classroom? Or can it? So if we think about our biases, right? And if we think back about those pictures that we have to define equity, right? When we're looking at getting them, equal access, right? We're trying to give them all the supports because of the things that they can't do. They can't see beyond the fence. So we're helping them get above that fence, right? But if equity is actually understanding and hearing what they need and then providing them with that, not the support that they need, but what they need based on what their strengths are, right? That's how we're going to provide a more equitable classroom. And I love what Stacy says, if we can become aware, then we can try to make changes to the way we interact with our students, 100%. As Ashley said, it does. It helps us break down that barrier. So we just need to be aware of, the biases that we have in our classroom and how do they influence our interaction with students. Because once we recognize those bias, we can then work to change them. And remember, increasing our knowledge can influence our perspective. Because we're not talking about learned bias. These are things that, as I said in the video, our brain sometimes just wants to fill in the missing information, right? We hear that a student with emotional disturbance is being put in our classroom. We fill in all that information with our previous experience of what we do know about another student with emotional disturbance that may or may not be the same. So we just want to make sure that we are increasing our knowledge so that we can then effectively remove those barriers in the classroom. Because if we have a positive perspective and a positive knowledge about all of our students, including the disabilities that are in our classroom, we'll be able to have a greater impact on all the students in our classroom.
I like what Amelia says. She said, yes, I think that as much as we believe ourselves to be open-minded and fair, we all have biases, and becoming aware of them is the first step.
Thank you. And that's the most important thing, I think. You hit it exactly on the head, Amelia, is that, we all do have biases because we all have different experiences. And it's being able to learn from those and recognize those as a first step. All right, Jean.
Okay, I'm going to talk about special education teachers and general education teachers and who's responsible for what when students are in the general education classroom. Now, I do want to let you know that we're not specifically talking about co-teaching. We realize that there's a lot of co-teaching happening. There's co-teaching happening in our district. And when Christy and I presented this workshop a few months ago, it was a half an hour longer than what we have available today. And so we had a whole section on co-teaching, but in order to fit the time frame, we cut that out. So I apologize if you're co-teaching and wanted that information, but some of this will still apply, obviously. So in the classroom, let's look at who's responsible. Accommodations. Special education teacher is responsible for giving the general education teacher the students' accommodations. It's nice to have them on a spreadsheet if possible. I'm not saying you have to, but if you have maybe 5 students in one class, there's a spreadsheet of the accommodations for the student, it helps the general education teacher. The general education teacher is responsible to look at those, know them, ask questions if they have them, voice concerns like, I'm not sure how I'm going to do this. They have to implement them. So this gen ed teacher can't say, oh, I'm not doing that. We'll get into that in a minute. But voice concerns and say, how are we going to work this out? How are we going to work this out if the student has extra time or they go to a small group setting for their test? So communicating between each other is essential. I was a resource student, right? I was a resource teacher in junior high for years. So I did work on this. I'm not going to use all of my experiences, but obviously some of them will come into play. It's also important to talk to the students and make sure they know, A, what their accommodations are, and the fact that you encourage them to advocate for them. Sometimes it's a little more difficult. You know, we know there are some students that do not want to go up to a teacher and say, I have extra time, or I need to have this read to me in a different classroom. But we want to make sure that they know that those are available to them. But it's also important to talk to the student and say, okay, this is how we're going to work this out. Does this work for you? For example, if a student needed to take a test in a small group setting, obviously the last thing you ever want to do is just go to the door and say, okay, you 3 are coming with me to my room to take a test. Not going to happen. So what I worked out with the teachers, and again, this was in junior high. I realize elementary, high school, you might tweak it a little bit, of course. But the students would get their test in the classroom. They would walk over to my room with their test to take it. I had a core outside my classroom, even though I was teaching other periods. I had a core area where the student could go in there, take the test. My assistant could read it to them, clarify directions, whatever they needed. That worked if the teacher was willing to let the student walk across with the test. In this day and age, obviously, a lot of tests are online, so that's not a problem. They just would come over. Basically, the thing is the students stand up and they just leave and everybody else starts the test. So nobody's asking questions, it's not making a big scene, and that worked best for the students. Did I have students who didn't want to come over? Yes. And of course, we're never going to drag a student out of a classroom, but we want to just continue to encourage them to maybe try this if we feel like it would help them. It's the same thing if they need extra time. Many of them are very willing to go up to the general education teacher at the end when they're handing in their test or at the end of the online test and say, I need more time. And then the general education teacher emails the special education teacher, lets them know Juan and Carlos needed extra time, and then the special ed teacher will work with them to get that done. So working together collaboratively with the students' input on how it's going to work with them is what seems to work best. Again, the accommodations do have to be implemented. Teachers can't just say, I'm not going to do that, which we'll get into in a couple minutes. Yes.
We just had a question that's related to that in the chat.
Yes.
Brittany asked, what do you do if parents refuse accommodation provided by the specialist? So
If the parents refuse it?
I have an answer, but you can answer it too.
Go ahead, because I've never had that.
Well, and so the legal rule is the accommodation needs to be offered. That's the legal rule. When you're talking about what your legal responsibility as a teacher is it needs to be offered. Kind of is along with like the offer of FAPE, right? If the parent is refusing the offer of FAPE, it still is documented in that IEP that it was offered. So the same thing with accommodations. If you had a discussion where the specialist suggested an accommodation, but it was absolutely refused, you would want that documented in the notes of that IEP, that what was suggested and then what the decision was. But again, if it's on the list as an accommodation, then you need to provide it. And if parents refuse, If it causes an issue, I would have an amendment with the meeting to discuss that, but just again, make sure that it was documented.
Speaking of documenting, I did want to mention that I'd say maybe 10 years ago, teachers used to say, well, he has this accommodation, but he never asked for it, so he didn't get it. But now we cannot use that as an excuse. If they have an accommodation, they're entitled to it, even if they do not ask for it. So let's say you have students in your room you should go to a small group setting or get extra time, and you quietly, privately talk to them, and they say, no, I do not want to go. Just document that too. And then an email to the special ed teacher, Tom, I asked Tom if he wanted to come to your room, even though he was on the list, and he said no, I just want to let you know. That way it's documented, also to document that for the parent too, because they are entitled to their accommodations, even if they don't ask for them. But it's important to talk to the students, especially as they go through junior high and high school, about what those accommodations are too.
Yeah. And we'll be talking about those accommodations modifications a little bit too.
Yes. Okay. Communicating with families. So it's always, who's going to contact the family? If there's missing assignments, if there's behavior, is it going to be the teacher? Is it going to be the case manager? So if there is one assignment or something that the student is unclear on or didn't do or needs some extra help, the classroom teacher would email the parent if there was just sometimes one assignment or something like that. Or let's say there were some kind of a behavior problem in the class one day, the general education teacher would email the parent because the special education teacher wasn't there and can't really give the information. CC the case manager, the special education teacher, when you are emailing the parent, to make sure they're in the loop about a missing assignment and about any behavior problems in the class. And then you can talk to them. I'll get back to email etiquette in a moment, but make sure you do that. But if there is a pattern of missing assignments, the special education teacher is going to be monitoring the students' grades. Looking at, we have Infinite Campus, other people have different kinds of grading systems. Looking at, okay, this student's missing 5 assignments in this classroom. There's something going on here. Then I'm going to talk to the parent. Then I'm going to, get them involved as the special education teacher. Let's say this goes on and there's a pattern of the student having some problems in the class. The special education teacher should call an IEP amendment. I've seen some cases, especially this last year, where nothing happened for months and months and months, and the student wasn't doing anything and nobody was contacting the parent, and suddenly the student has an IEP and they have this F because they haven't done anything. That special education teacher should have had an IEP amendment before that, weeks and weeks and weeks before that, to make sure that everybody came together so that they could support the student and find out what's going on. Why are they missing these assignments? Why is their grade failing? The same thing if they had some behavior issues too. So we're going to get to email etiquette. Couple things that have happened in our district, and then some other just basic things with email. When you're emailing, do not use the student's name. You probably know this. Do not use the student's name in the heading of the email. I would not even use their initials. Because if you do not know, if the case goes to due process or to court, lawyers can go through all your emails and they can pull the ones that they see that student's name or anything that looks like their initials up there. And then they can read everything that's in the body of the emails. Sometimes things you don't really want them to be reading. So best practice is to just say student concern or student in period 4 or something like that. Now, here's another thing about emailing. First of all, don't hit reply all, and we'll get to that in a moment. So if you are emailing teachers, special education teachers, if you're emailing the students' teachers to find out input, let's say for an IEP, you want input about how they're doing in the class. It's fine to copy a few teachers on there. Do not put the parent on the same email. Because if you copy the parent and the teachers, here's what could happen. This happened a few months ago in our district. Somebody emailed to find out how a student was doing, put the parent on there too. Oh, I'll make my life easier. I'm going to get the parents' input. I'm going to get the teachers' input all at the same time. Teachers emailed back about all the horrible things about the student, and they did reply all. And parent got that information. Now, I believe, Christy, we heard that actually didn't go to court or anything. That was just a very embarrassing situation for the person who had sent the email, and took a while to get over that. But that was not a good situation. Another one that did go to court, there was a special education teacher who was sending out their accommodations to the gen ed teachers. That's a great idea. You want to do that. We just had another IEP. I want to make sure they have all their accommodations. But she decided she was also going to copy the parents on those accommodations too, just so the parents would know she's doing her job. So you got the parents and you got the teachers on the accommodation list. Unfortunately, two of the teachers decided they weren't going to do those accommodations, and they replied all and sent back, I'm not doing this, this, and this. And that went to court. And my understanding is now those teachers are documenting every accommodation and sending it into court that they're doing. So there's just a couple examples Christy and I have heard about lately about making sure that you are keeping parents and teachers' emails separately. Anything to add on that, Christy?
Keep them separate.
Okay. Any questions on that, or nothing's come up, right?
No, not that I've seen.
Okay, great. Preparing IEPs. So preparing the IEP, obviously the special education teacher is the one who's responsible for preparing all that paperwork. But you as the general education teacher, and I'm saying you because I think we have a mix, the general education teacher is responsible to give the teacher input about the student. Like I was just saying, it's fine to email several general education teachers and ask for input, just don't put the parents on the same one. You want to get input from them, but on ways, separate email or a personal phone call. So when you are giving input to the special education teacher for the IEP, they're going to ask you about how they're doing in the class. Yes, they can look at the grades on Infinite Campus. Sorry, Infinite Campus is not what you have on the grade program. They can look at the grades, but they can find out a little more detailed information from you. And the student also has goals. So let's say, for example, you're a math teacher and the student has a goal to solve two-step equations. The special education teacher is going to ask you, how are they doing on this goal? They're supposed to be able to solve them with 80% accuracy. How do you think they're doing? Do you think they've met that? So please give them the input that they need, give them some information, send them some comments about how the student's doing in the class. Try to put some positive comments in there also. Special education teachers, when you get those comments from the teachers, don't just cut and paste them into the IEP. Make sure you read them and see what they sound like. Sometimes you have to make them a little more politically correct or friendly so that if the teacher was having a bad day and was saying some negative things about the student, you want to put them in the IEP in a way that's not going to upset the parent. There's a way to say things, as you all know, in a way that if the student's having difficulties, you can put it in a way that's not going to be lambasting the student. So please give input on that. When you're invited to an IEP as a general education teacher, you do need to attend. Obviously, you should not be attending all of the case manager's IEPs, but when you're invited, it's important to attend because it's legally mandated that a general education teacher be at an IEP. It's not going to be a legal document without your input. And so they need you to attend the IEP. Normally, they will have you there for a short period. I say normally, it's been in the past practice to have you there for a short time. It depends on the school. It depends on the parent. Sometimes they dismiss you after a short period of time. Sometimes the parent wants you to stay the entire time. So be prepared in case you might have to stay the entire time. The benefit of staying is that you do get to hear about the goals and the accommodations and get some input into that. When you go to the IEP, you're probably going to be asked to report on the student, one of the first parts of the IEP. And it's so important to start with strengths, start with something positive about this student. Because the worst IEPs I've ever been in or seen are the ones where the teacher starts, he hasn't done an assignment in 3 months and he's horrible. Oh my God, that's just gonna go south fast. So even if the student is in your class and he hasn't done anything in 2 months, he's been talking out and disrupting, you can start off with something positive such as, Johnny is such an enthusiastic student. That's a code for he likes to talk a lot. So you can start off with something positive. I'm sure, I know I see people smiling. You can find something positive that's going to start the meeting off. Then of course you're going to come up with your concerns because you do need to talk about them. Special ed teachers, best practice. I know it's not always possible. I totally know this. Best practice is to invite the teacher whose class the student's having the most difficulty in. So if they're having a lot of trouble in math, you want to try to get the math teacher there. Because if you bring in the art teacher where he's, got an A+, yeah, that's going to be nice. It's going to sound good, but it's not really going to help the IEP as much as if you invite the teacher where he's having a lot of difficulty. And then there is, oh, I'm sorry. One more thing for general education teachers. When you go to the meeting, be prepared to talk about any support you're giving that student in the class. The parent might ask, how are you supporting him? How are you helping him with certain things? Progress reports and goals. You probably know, and if you don't, special education teachers need to report on progress on goals for students quarterly at the same time the report cards are due. So they're going to be asking you for input on there because sometimes it's more challenging to determine students' progress on a goal, especially for teachers. Some special education teachers don't see the students frequently or even in any class, and they're trying to assess how they're doing by looking on the internet, on the grades. But if they get your input on, how is he doing? How did he do in class on these assignments? Can he write a 3-paragraph essay? How is that? Because a lot of times they will have those kinds of goals, and the teacher would really appreciate your input on those progress reports so that they can send them out, which they have to, and accurately report to the parents. Okay, Christy, what have I forgotten?
I think it was good, Jean.
Anybody else questions? And I apologize, it's a little more geared to junior high and high school. I did spend time in elementary. Actually, I have an elementary education degree, which is kind of funny. But I do. It's kind of, does anybody know that in the office, Christy? I don't know.
I don't know. That's a good question, June.
That's what I majored in college a long
but it still applies. I think, sometimes the setup is a little bit different because they may not be, they're not rotating classes quite the same way.
Right.
A lot of the elementary, there's a little bit more inclusion.
Yes, which is really nice. Yeah. Okay.
Good. All right. I think this is you too. You can keep going.
I can keep going. Okay. Responsive classroom. This is a classroom where you are responsive to the students' needs, who the students are. You're being proactive, not reactive. You're planning things in advance for what might happen, what my students might need, what this lesson is going to look like for these students, knowing their different needs. So you want to design lessons based on your knowledge of your students. Students obviously have multiple ways that they're going to access the content, and all of them have various skills, strengths, needs, and learning styles. We want to design lessons based on that information and identify strategies that are going to help move them along so that they meet their learning objectives. avoid deficit thinking, avoid thinking, okay, this person, I know they can't do this. Avoid thinking about that. Look more at their strengths. Okay, this person can do this. For example, I remember a student I had named Jordan. I think he just graduated from high school last year. I had him in 7th and 8th grade. Jordan could not read at all, hardly. And he did not do well in any of my tests. I taught history, SDCC history, most of my time. But Jordan was such an excellent artist. So anytime we had any kind of history project where you could demonstrate your knowledge about different aspects of history by bringing in art, he excelled. He was the shining star. And, so I would make sure then to show his as the example to other classes. So looking at students, looking at them like they have some deficit, but I'm going to work with their strengths. Also, understand their disability. Christy was talking to me about this the other day, of an example of ADHD. We all know about ADHD. I certainly do. My daughter had ADHD, and so I certainly am familiar with that. She actually has it. She didn't outgrow it, even though she's now grown up and in business. But so we know it's a neurological condition, affects their executive functioning. But we always think they can't focus, they can't pay attention to anything, they're impulsive. However, it's because they're focusing on too many things. They can focus on this, and this at the same time, and they need our help determining what's the important thing for me to focus on right now. And so we need to assist them with that by being consistent with routines and reminders and breaking down the tasks so that they're able to be supported in doing that. So looking at each student's disability and knowing it so that you can plan lessons and activities around that. And observing your students and reflecting on your decisions moment to moment that you make in the class. I was talking to one of my new teachers yesterday about this, and she at the beginning of the year would just plan this lesson. And I got it all planned, and this is the way it's going to go. And then something would happen, and now she's proactively thinking in advance. Okay, I'm going to do this. What might happen? What's going to be needed? What does this student need? Those kind of things. So just growing in that way is really helpful. And I was happy to see my teacher talking about that yesterday.
Right. So as teachers, both special ed teachers and gen ed teachers, we have a responsibility to provide access to the curriculum, right? So for our students with special needs, we have a responsibility to provide access to the gen ed curriculum, right? We need to be able to keep those same expectations for all of our students. But the reason we have accommodations and modifications are to identify the supports or the options that will help those students succeed, right? So we have reviewed that we have a responsibility to provide those accommodations and modifications in IEPs and 504 plans, right? We are supposed to offer those accommodations, whether or not student or either parent wants them. We do need to provide them. And we're providing those accommodations and modifications to evaluate and grade students in a manner to make sure that they're not penalized for their disability. We want to make sure that we're judging against students on their strengths. They're not receiving a failing grade because they can't read, referring to, Jordan. If you have a student that's not read, you're not going to be testing him on his, reading comprehension, right? You're going to be testing his knowledge in a different way. And that's what our accommodations and modifications do. We want to make sure that we are considering, when we're providing accommodations and modifications, make sure that we're looking at all of our students. It's okay to provide accommodations for all of the students. You can do that, right? Maybe, like the accommodation of alternate response options. Why not have that as a possibility for all of your students? One, it can help your student that, especially your secondary students, that sometimes they don't want to have to accept that accommodation because they don't want extra attention brought on them. But if you have those accommodations offered to everybody, because again, you're providing support for access, you're not changing what you are grading, it can help them feel more confident and more secure. Additional time. I know there are a lot of students, gen ed teachers, that provide additional time for all of their students as an accommodation. It's not another thought that just left my head again. So again, we just want to make sure that we are providing a positive climate of acceptance for all of our students, right? So again, if you're providing an accommodation or a modification, you're not calling the student out. You want to make sure that you're not drawing attention to the student, to what their needs are, because that does not promote a climate of acceptance, especially our junior high and high school students. They're can be very self-conscious, but we want to make sure that they feel welcome and supported in our classrooms. And so now we're going to be looking at additional ways to do that are through accommodations and modifications that we've talked about, but also specialized instructional different strategies. So as a reminder, again, accommodations don't change the content, right? But they support students' access to the gen ed curriculum by giving things like extra time, large print materials, pre-written guided notes, audio accessibility. Those are just a couple of examples. I loved this comparison. A few weeks ago, I was listening to a podcast and they were talking about accommodations and modifications. And they were thinking, the person that was being interviewed on the podcast recognized that when they first started teaching, they were really hesitant to providing accommodations because they just thought it just wasn't fair, right? They were much more about that fairness. And then the podcaster attributed to accommodation to wearing glasses, which, I can relate to, right? Because it was the idea that if a student is taking the driving test, for example, right, and they have a vision impairment, it's not fair to grade them on that vision test, on the driving test, if they're not provided glasses to be able to see appropriately. The glasses allow them to see the road, they allow them to see the sign, so that then you can judge their driving and their understanding of those driving skills, of those driving signs, and you're not judging their poor vision, if that makes sense. So I like that comparison. Brittany has a question in the chat about the wobbly seats. It is hard when you don't have those things for every single student. So then depending on your classroom, my recommendation that I've seen have worked well is, using those as kind of as an as needed basis. And so you may have to give priority seating to some students that do have that accommodation, but there could be times where, things like fidgets or wobbly seats or noise canceling headphones, if you are able to have more of those in your classroom, to be able to offer additional time for those. But I think you do, Jean, correct me if you think differently, but you would have to provide those with those accommodations specifically priority in your classroom if you're unfortunate not to have enough for multiple students. Right. Yeah, donors choose is also great. About a lot of things who donors choose. All right, so for modifications adapt the content or adapt or change what the student is going to be expected to learn, what they're graded on, or what they demonstrate. So again, the difference is that a modification sometimes changes. That's why a lot of modifications that are in classes don't qualify for those A through G requirements. And then we're looking at the specialized instructional strategies. Now, specialized instructional strategies are different methods to deliver the content. We should be familiar with a lot of these things. These are the popular teaching strategies, instructional strategies that we use, like think, pair, share, graphic organizers, collaborative learning, breaking down a concept into more easily understood parts and segments. That's not an accommodation, that's in a specialized instructional strategy, right? And our goal of using a variety of those instructional strategies are to achieve the learning objectives for all of our students. And that's why the more that we know about our students, the better able we are to design instructional strategies that meet all of those needs. We're going to give you access to this slide presentation at the end also. So if you have some of the information from these charts, we're going to have those there. I can't talk at the same time. I'm trying to open the chat too. So we also have some additional examples. So I just put a link to a PDF in the chat now, some different examples of some accommodations and modifications. So you can look at that. And then Jean, as you're talking, so this is an example of the classroom accommodations and modifications. And for time, we're not going to review all of those to you, but you have access to those through the link in the chat. And then Jean's going to continue our discussion of accommodations and modifications.
Okay, so here's just, excuse me, here's just a few types of accommodations. Remember, this is just providing access, but does not alter the curriculum or the assessment. If you were changing the number of items the student was completing for math problems, let's say they had 20 multiplication problems and this student works very slowly and it was laborsome to do 20. They had 10, but they were the same type of problems, representative of the same ones. That's an accommodation, reducing that if you have the same type of problems. Of course, we all know about the extra time for testing, for assignments sometimes, that's an accommodation. The student might get guided notes to use for a class. Other students are taking other types of notes. Instead of writing a research paper for world history, they might create a poster. This is an accommodation, but this kind of reminds me of what Christy was talking about. You can give accommodations to all your students because teachers I'm noticing recently, at least a few that I've been working with, are giving assessments where students do have a menu of options that they can create posters or playlists or some kind of illustrated timeline for a book instead of writing a paper. So if you're giving that to the whole class, that's fine. If you're just having one student have that, that would be an accommodation for them. And then another accommodation that I used in my special day class history was reading the test out loud to them. And the reason that was an accommodation and not a modification was I wasn't testing their reading comprehension. I was testing their history content knowledge. So I read it to them because, again, that just leveled the playing field for the people who had difficulty reading, but they knew the history content. And then modifications are changing the learning goal or the grade level standard. They don't meet those A through G requirements. We sometimes have some of these in special day classes. We have modifications. So if you think about back to the math problems, a modification would be if students had to do 20 fraction problems with uncommon denominators. A modification would be if a student is only doing 10 with common denominators. So you're assessing that student's ability to add or subtract fractions with common denominators, whereas other students are working on more difficult with uncommon denominators. So that would be a modification for that student. Again, if a student's just creating maybe some bullet points in English for a writing task instead of an essay, again, a modification. If somebody had 12 vocabulary words for a social studies unit and somebody else only had to know 3 of them, again, a modification. So, and then Christy has one down there. The student answers yes or no questions using their eyes if they're nonverbal.
Okay. Mhm. All right. So again, when we're talking about most effective strategies to support students, it's those proactive student support. I love this quotation that says, "We don't rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training." And we need to think of that in terms of our students also, right? We can set great expectations that we think are completely achievable. But if we don't train them, if we don't provide those steps for them to reach those expectations, they're not going to be able to do that, or they're less likely to be able to do that. So, relationships, as we've heard before, we need to build relationships, right? Relationships are huge to student support. And when you're talking about supporting students with special needs, they're incredibly important because you need to develop that trust between all of our students. But it's important to remember that relationships are only just the first step, right? We need to do more than that. So rules plus relationships equals respect, but rules without relationships equals rebellion, right? And I think we've seen a lot of this year. If any of you have taught last year, if you did your student teaching last year or a couple of years before that, I've been in a lot of classrooms where the structure or the rules have decreased a little bit, right? Because we're focusing on building those relationships. Well, in the classrooms that's happened with, behavior has increased. But behavior is increased not because they don't, like the teacher, not because they don't feel safe, but because there's not those rules to provide that guidance to them. So we need to support the positive relationships that we have with our students by having those clear classroom procedures. And again, I loved another podcast I listened to. They had it like the 3 C's of classroom management. And I think it's not only for classroom management, but it's going to help us in supporting all of our students with all of our instructional strategies. It's the clear expectations, consistent reminders, and consistency. So our clear expectations, we need to provide visual auditory access to all of our instructions, right? We need to write things on the board. If you have instructions for an assignment, it is written on the assignment as well as on the board. And then you're also reading those same instructions. And additionally, we need to provide that same access later. So if you're using Canvas or Google Classroom, being able to have both the visual and auditory instructions on any of the things that you post on Google Classroom can be incredibly beneficial. The second are constant reminders. Remember that you're going to have to repeat yourself again and again and again. And I love this thought because how many times have I been in my classroom where I'm like, it is April. We do this every single day. How do my students not know, what they're supposed to do? But again, just take that pause to go, okay, I don't know what's going on in their head that day. I don't know what happened in the period before, right? Maybe they're in a state of stress. I can't remember, my kids' names at moments sometimes, and I know my kids' names, right? So those constant reminders just go to reinforce our classroom procedures and again, to provide that consistency, those clear consistency for students to know what you ask them to do. Okay, I just got a weird message that popped up. That's not letting me go away, so I'm just going to move it for a second. All right. And also with the consistency, we want to make sure that our expectations and our procedures are consistent between students, right? That we're providing that same support, whether it's a student that we happen to have known their family for like 15 years, or a student who's new to our classroom who we've never met before. We want to make sure that all of those things are very consistent throughout. All right.
Okay, somebody's coming in.
There we go.
Okay, so how are our classrooms designed to eliminate those barriers? The barriers that Christy was talking about, the barriers that we don't see but are there. They're invisible barriers, but they're there for students. So we want to have some additional strategies that we can give them, that we can think about, because one size fits all approach is going to exclude many students, especially those with disabilities, and students, English learners. Lots of different students are going to be excluded with one size fits all. So flexibility and choice is key for students. We were talking about students having a choice. To-do lists, and then there's a may-do list. This is a to-do list. This is a may-do list. You may do this if you finish, or you have free time, you may do this. Preferred working style is important, and flexible seating is what's the best place for this student. ADHD, not necessarily in the front row. When the student would get accommodation for preferred seating, used to be people went, oh, I'm going to put the ADHD student in the front. Actually, years ago, I have to tell you this. I think we have a minute. When my daughter was in high school, she had a 504 plan, didn't qualify for special ed, but she had ADHD, like I told you. And the worst thing ever was when this teacher one time looked at a roster on the first day and went, oh, Lauren Kaufman, it says you have to sit in the front row. That, you know, you can imagine how well that went over with all of us. But front row is not the most best place for a student with ADHD, because as I found out once, and just need to learn it once, that student might be up there entertaining the class. And so that student in the front with all kinds of energy, that might not be the best place for them. Maybe on the side over, they're still in the front, but on the side. So whatever works best for this student's need. Again, with the environment, with the lights, with the sound. As Christy was telling you, those audio directions are so important. If you make sure that they have audio and visual reinforcement, and the chunking the assignments into chunks that they can manageably, instead of a really long assignment that they have no idea where to start, because executive functioning skills really inhibit them from being successful with that. Brain breaks are important during the period now, especially a lot of our schools now are having block schedules. And even without a block schedule, a little tiny break in the middle of class can really be beneficial for students, because they were used to being home on Zoom or not on Zoom or whatever they were doing. So a little break in there. And a timer is important to show them how much time they have allotted for the rest of their assignment. They're an example of looking at your lesson plan and thinking like a student and not a teacher. Does this make sense as a student? There was a teacher a few weeks ago, one of our other teachers in our office was mentoring a brand new culinary teacher, and she had this lesson she wanted to teach in high school. And so she thought this would be great, even though she has a lot of students with special needs in her classes and has large culinary classes. They were going to be making, I believe it was muffins or something like that, but they were going to be needing to use fractions, and they were going to need to work with fractions to measure things and decide how to break this recipe down in half. And when the teacher looked at this with her mentor, she realized this was going to be way too challenging for those students without any kind of support. Yes, they could probably do those fractions in a math class, but then when they went into the culinary, if they were just thrown at them in that recipe, they were going to need a little more support. So thinking, does this work for the students that I have? And Christy has given us a fabulous link there. Are you going to show that? This has so many
So this one,
Intervention examples.
so I shared this with you in the chat because there is way too much to go over in the short workshop. If we were doing this live, when we do this live, this is a handout that you get. So take this and make some comments about what you can do in your classroom. It talks about the disabilities and areas of weakness like ADHD, autism, deaf and hard of hearing, emotional disturbance, specific learning disabilities. Again, this is not all inclusive, and we know that, but we're hoping that it provides you a little bit of, just additional things to get your mind thinking. You'll notice the consistent routines, simple, clear words. Just highlighting a couple of things as I go through. A variety of different response options. There's a lot of crossover of supportive strategies that will meet the needs. Again, we're just talking about general needs that are related to that disability area. So they may or may not work with your student. So think of what you can do. So hopefully this is a good resource for you to use later also. All right, let me grab back. Okay. I apologize for my delay. Go back to this. All right, am I on the right slide again, Jean?
Your supports for collaborative learning, which is
Okay.
me. That's next. Okay. So a couple of years ago, I don't know, a year and a half ago, we were on Zoom for instruction. I think that most of you were too. So students were home and teachers were trying to get them to collaborate with each other. And because they couldn't see each other, they couldn't work in their groups like they had been prior to that time. And so they were putting them into breakout rooms. And Christy and I were in a lot of those because when we work with our teachers, we observe them frequently, even we did on Zoom. And you go into the breakout rooms, and if you were teaching, you have this experience, you go into the breakout room, what's in there? It's crickets, crickets, crickets. The kids are in there and they're supposed to be collaborating. They're supposed to be working as a group. And every single time I went in, there were like 4 kids just doing their own thing with their head down like this. And even though the teacher had explained kind of what they were doing, they went in there and they didn't work together. Okay, now we're back in the classroom and they came back, but they're not quite ready to collaborate with their peers again. They're not quite ready to socialize with their peers again. So what they need is they need instruction on how to do this. They need repeated, as Chrissy said, we repeat. Instruction on how to work collaboratively. How does this work? What do we do? They struggle with this. And so before we assign collaborative work and then put them in groups and they just sit there, we need to make sure that we give them some things. So first of all, we want to model what the interaction is going to look like. You can model exactly what they're going to be doing, specifically give the instructions. What is this going to look like? And for the instructions, they should be visual and they should be auditory. And then I would recommend leaving them up on the screen. So I visualized once you've given the instructions and once everybody's in their groups in the room, those instructions are still up on the screen for everybody to access while they're working in their groups in case they forget, oh, what am I supposed to be doing and what's next? It's important for them to have roles, and I know you've heard this before, specific roles and responsibilities for every single student. That's just so important because if anybody gets left out and doesn't have a role, then they just kind of sit there. And even if we give specific instructions and model it and they don't have roles, one person might take over and everybody else just might sit there. So those are important too. Strategic grouping. Know your students, know how you're going to pair them or group them academically, socially, emotionally. We know that there are those kids who can't be in the same group. We know there are some who should definitely be separated. And then you want to look at, okay, the students with disabilities. Do you want to put them all in the same group? Over there, oh, wait, I have 5 students with disabilities and I'm an instructional assistant. So let's put them all there in one group, all by themselves, and the IA can work with them. That's not good because that's so segregating for them. They're not really included. It's like that barrier is kind of there. You don't see it, but it is because they're over in that group. So you would not want to do that most of the time. There might be a couple circumstances, but not normally. What you want to do is you want to group them so that they are with someone who is a peer who likes to help other students, who's kind to other students, maybe someone who's a little higher, but also kind and can help them. So you want to strategically group the students. Having the students pick their own groups is, occasionally that can work for some type of activity, but it doesn't usually work very well, especially if you're doing the specific instruction and roles and strategic grouping. That works best. Anything else, Christy, on that?
That was good. All right, so we also wanted to cover strategies when working with students with more intense needs. How many of you, just by a raise of a virtual hand or in the chat, have students that you work with that have those more intense needs, either multiple disabilities, more severe disabilities, more severe emotional disturbance? Okay, it looks like we do have a few. Good. So we're going to go back, and if you don't currently have a student with more intense needs, then consider what you may need to implement or what you would like to change in your classroom to support them in the future. Because you will at some point in your career if you don't yet. So again, we want to develop those positive relationships. Getting to know your students' strengths and interests is going to make really all the difference. They want to make sure that they feel safe, that they feel appreciated, right? And you can do that by building those positive relationships and getting to know them individually. Also building motivation, right? As we get to know our students, we get to know what motivates them. Motivation is the engine that drives engagement, right? You can have really, really engaged, something that you find really, really engaging, but if it's not motivating to the students aren't going to engage. So you want to make sure that you're finding what motivates each of your students, and you're doing that by getting to know each of your students. Those structure routines and clear procedures are even more important with students with more intense needs. They rely on those structures and routines. And if for whatever reason you need to change your structure, you need to change your routine, you need to make sure that you give them notice ahead of time. You have the opportunity to prepare them for those changes. Like if you had a student with more intense needs and you needed to do a seating chart change, you should probably not tell them as they're walking into the door of class that day, but prep them before then to let them know why. I was in a class once where they did do an immediate seating change, and the student thought that they had done something wrong, shut down for the rest of the period because they were sure that the seating change was because they had done something wrong. And all it took was the teacher just needed to explain to them before, but unfortunately they'd lost an entire day of engagement in that classroom because the teacher didn't realize that until after the fact, right? So be thinking of those things, again, planning for those things ahead of time. Offer choice. Again, this is going to be key if you're trying to especially get to know the students, having a variety of choices for them to demonstrate how they understand things, but also choice of assignments, right? Maybe if you're doing a project and you want them to, they have the choice of writing an essay, maybe, creating a comic strip instead of writing the essay. Obviously, this wouldn't be in like an English class where you're testing writing the essay, because that would be a modification, right? But trying to find choices for them. And also when you have activities that you are expecting all of the students to participate in, try to alternate between preferred activities and less preferred activities, right? So you can always have them go back and forth. Again, if we're building that motivation, if they know, okay, look, I have to sit down and I don't like working with groups, but I'm going to be in the supported group. I need to stay in this group for 10 minutes. But after that, then I'm going to be able to, go work on my comic strip on my computer by myself, because I prefer independent work, right? You want to have that balance. Make sure that you provide opportunities for peer interaction. A lot of our students with more intense needs, the reason that they are in our general ed settings is for that peer interaction, right? A lot of our students with more intense needs are not working on grade level general ed curriculum. So they have access to it, but we need to provide opportunities for additional interaction. It's also really interesting to see how students can sometimes increase their skill when they're working with a peer, when they're highly motivated by working with a peer, other than just working with their instructional assistant or with a teacher. If you're working with a student that is or can be emotionally unpredictable, make sure that you look for those warning signs. If you have students that are either flagged in your grading system or you're giving access to their IEP or their accommodations, know what their disability is. Make sure, if you're a general education teacher, you're reaching out to the case manager to talk about what signs do I need to be aware of. And if you're a special education teacher and have some of those students on your caseload, make sure that you're communicating with the teachers that that student may interact with about what those warning signs are. Because the more you know, the more you can prepare, right? So if you know what warning signs to look at, you know when you need to ask the student to take a break prior to the behavior escalating, right? Additionally, take opportunities for students to recognize their own signs of being emotionally upset and to implement self-calming strategies. Again, this is something that we can use with all of our students, right? We have students that get frustrated for a variety of reasons. Those same strategies can work with all of our students that we are going to use with somebody with more intense needs. For example, if someone's showing demonstration of being really frustrated or angry, and it could be just asking them, you seem more frustrated for a moment. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about it and let me come back to you. Or you may need some help and you have a student that's really resistant to help. If you're starting to see as they're receiving help, their frustration is increasing, maybe you need to step away for a minute and then come back. One of the biggest strategies is to just avoid the discussion of who's right? Don't get into a power struggle ever with students. You will lose 100%. Even if you win the argument, you're going to lose that war. Addressing students privately and in a quiet voice is also really key, especially when we're working with some of our students that have more emotional needs. Calling them out, calling from across the room and addressing, Joey, I need you to, stop screaming or whatever it is, again, can cause undue stress. Whereas just going up to them, circulating through the classroom, maybe you're giving a nonverbal cue to a student that needs to, quiet down a little bit. Or I was in a classroom once where a student needed a fidget tool, but the fidget tool that they were currently using was incredibly distracting. It was just really, really loud. And it was during a time where other students were presenting information. So the other students had quieter voices. All the teacher needed to do was just go and exchange the toy, exchange the fidget, right? So the student still had access to what they needed, but was able to really discreetly just change that without calling attention to that student. Additionally, make sure that we use planned ignoring. Now, again, if we don't know our student, we don't know what to plan to ignore. And so, getting to know our students through relationships and understanding what their disability is going to be key. But a lot of times, if a student wants attention, if they're acting up because they want attention, then we need to make sure that we use planned ignoring. A lot of the students with more intense needs will have behavior support plans or behavior intervention plans. Make sure that you ask and make sure you know what those procedures are. For those of you who are not familiar with either one of those support plans, there are step-by-step instructions of what to do to identify what things to put into place before the behavior starts, as soon as the behavior starts, and when the behavior escalates, what the reaction needs to be, right? So you want to make sure that you are aware of what all of those things are. The purpose of a behavior support plan is so that there can be the exact same implementation and support given in all settings, right? We're not able to do that if we're not familiar with that. So if you're a case manager, make sure you're sharing that information with your other teachers. Jean, I'm looking at our time, and as we thought, it is coming close to 5:30. We want to have some time for you to also to fill out a reflection form. So I'm going to put in the chat as you're doing that, a copy to all of our slides that has this information. Our last strategy that we were hoping we would have enough time to go over is working with assistants. Assistants are going to be key for support with students with disabilities. But planning for them and communicating with them, if we just wanted to summarize how best to use them,
Yes.
those two things, right?
With them, yes.
Yeah, plan for them in advance, plan for your use of them in advance, and then communicate with that to them in advance also. Anything else, Jean, before we put the other things in the chat?
No, I was just going to, when I was talking about working with assistants, I was going to say in our district, Christine, I have the new teachers do something called classroom vision, where they sit down with the assistant at the beginning of the year saying, here's my vision for the classroom as far as, respect and cell phone use, and present it to the assistant, not as these are the rules for you, but this is the way that we in the classroom are going to conduct ourselves, kind of being a team with the instructional assistant. It's a way to present your classroom expectations to them in a way that you're not bossing them around, but you're getting them on board with you.
Yeah. So as we come to the end, and we don't have, let me do this. So I just added the link to our slides that does have some of these additional resources also on it. These are some great resources to learn some more information about a variety of disabilities, some additional strategies to use with different disabilities also. So, I know you have lots of free time as a teacher, but maybe if you have insomnia, like I do sometimes, you can look up in hopes of being able to go back to sleep. And before we leave, there is an exit ticket. So it's a Google form that I've just added to the chat. If you could please fill that out. We appreciate your feedback. We like this presentation. We are always adjusting this presentation. So your feedback is important to us. And I know the consortium appreciates your feedback also. And then before you have any other final thoughts, Jean, the one thing I just wanted to say is, with all this information that we have provided you today, just take a second before you move on to your next thing. Remember back to what your biases are, being able to recognize those, then develop that plan of how you want to change those by getting to know your students. And then third, planning using some of the strategies that we've reviewed today to be able to better support your students with special needs. And I promise if you do that, you will support all of your students more effectively. Jean?
Christy, I agree 100% with you. So thank you. And I appreciate everybody's attendance today. It was nice to see you.
All right. And I'm just going to give us kudos for 5:30 on the dot. So we'll hang around if any of you guys have any specific questions for us. Otherwise, thank you for joining us, and we will see you at another time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is it just us? Oh, Annabelle's still here. Annabelle, do you have questions?
Hi, yes, I was just wondering, there was a comment made about how to instruct the teacher's assistant without kind of seeming bossy, and I missed that point.
Oh, I missed that comment.
Right. Well, because we didn't say too much because we kind of ran out of time.
It might have been like to provide journaling ahead of time for them. It just, my phone cut out a little bit. And I think that might have been what it was. I know we didn't get a chance to go into that slide.
I know that's a challenge. I think especially if you are, if you're younger than your instructional assistant, or the instructional assistant has, been in education a lot longer than you. Sometimes it can have that feeling of you being, bossy, but you're both there. The purpose of you being there is to support the students, right?
Right.
Now, the teacher is the one that's supposed to have more expertise. And I didn't say experience, right? Because we know instructional assistants, there are some amazing instructional assistants that have many more years of experience, but it's different than the current expertise, especially if you're a new teacher, right? And so I think balancing, recognizing the strengths that your instructional assistant has with that common goal, as Jean referred to that classroom vision, right? If you can share with the assistant what your common goal is for student success and let them know that you need their help to be able to get there, you are more likely to elicit their participation. And then we were talking about just being bossy. A lot of it's just following up and, watching your tone, of course, but just letting them know, that you need them to do that. And the reality is if they are being resistant and not doing what you ask, you do need to reinforce it, because you're responsible for those students to learn. And if need help, if you are dealing with a really difficult instructional assistant that is not doing what they're asked, elicit help from your administration.
Okay. Fortunately, I've never been in that situation, but that is, words of wisdom for, something that could potentially happen. I do mentor teachers. And one of the things that did come up with one of my mentees, because she graduated from school and is in her early 20s and had experienced something similar to somebody that had more years of experience, but she was able to work it out with some school staff support on common goals and having that discussion, and some misunderstandings I think she was mentioning to me. So, it was me indirectly trying to positively impact that situation as well. So I appreciate it.
Yeah, I think those common goals has been helpful for me at least.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the presentation.
Yeah, thank
Take
you for
care.
joining, Annabelle.
Welcome.
Absolutely. Take care. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Jacqueline, do you have questions?
Jacqueline?
I'm mute.
Did she go? I think I accidentally.
I was just trying to find the link for the survey.
For the survey?
Yes, I'm new to Zooms. I can't.
Let
open
me,
the
I just
chat.
added it to the chat again. You should be able to just click on the link in the chat.
Thank you. I had a problem. I did do that and there was an error, so I'm going to copy it.
No worries.
Try again.
Thank you for coming back.
Thank you. I got it now. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a good night.
Thanks, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I know she came back and I thought, am I letting someone in at the last minute? But I figured they'd already been there.